Hello and welcome to this week's hospital capacity update video for Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. This week, 77.41% of all hospital beds are currently in use in the country among 5,405 hospitals, reporting 3.96% are being used for coronavirus. 27,596 people are in the hospital for coronavirus. 550,167 beds are being used out of 710,633. There are roughly about 17 states this week on the list, so slightly less than last week. And let's go to our first state. Our first state this week is Connecticut. And Connecticut this week is using 80.34% of all beds. Remember, what we do in this is we're looking for any state that is using over 80% of their hospital bed capacity. So this week, Connecticut actually improved slightly to just 80.34%, so they still made it, but barely. And 6.11% of their hospitalizations in their state are for coronavirus, with 455 people in the hospital for coronavirus. The next state on our list is Delaware. And Delaware this week is using 82.88% of all beds, with 5.55% being used for coronavirus and 150 coronavirus patients. Next on our list is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. this week is using 81.93% of all beds, with 4.11% being used for coronavirus and 134 coronavirus patients in their state. Next on our list is Georgia. And Georgia this week is using 83.29% of all beds, with 4.79% being used for coronavirus and 930 coronavirus patients at this time. Next comes up Hawaii. Hawaii was on the list a couple weeks ago. It got taken off the list last week, and now it's back on the list again, with 81.2% of all beds being used in Hawaii. 5.55% of them are being used for coronavirus, and 137 coronavirus patients in the state of Hawaii. Maryland, yet again, makes the list this week. Maryland is at 82.4% of all beds in use. 6.95% of them are being used for coronavirus, with 696 coronavirus patients. Massachusetts continues to be on the list, and Massachusetts, things are just not getting any better in Massachusetts. 89.21% of all beds being used in Massachusetts, and 3.77% of them are being used for coronavirus, with 677 coronavirus patients, and 16,122 beds being used out of 18,071 beds. Continuing on our list here, next comes up is Michigan. Michigan is currently using 81.95% of all beds, with 5.88% of them being used for coronavirus, 1,246 coronavirus patients in their beds at this time. The next state on our list is Minnesota. Minnesota this week has 84.24% of all beds being used. That's a little slightly worse than last week, with 6% of their beds being used for coronavirus and 543 coronavirus patients. Missouri is also on the list yet again this week. And in Missouri, we are seeing 84.59% of all beds being used, with 4.96% being used for coronavirus and 741 coronavirus patients. Next on the list is New Hampshire. New Hampshire's been on the list since I started doing this, and New Hampshire this week has 82.7% of all beds being used, 4.81% being used for coronavirus, and 125 coronavirus patients. New York is the next state on our list this week, and in New York we see 80.82% of all beds being used, 7.13% of them being used for coronavirus, 3,197 coronavirus patients this week, and if you're wondering, that is an increase in coronavirus patients this week in New York State, ever so slightly. The next state on our list is Ohio. Last week we had Oregon on the list. Oregon did not make the list this week, but in Ohio this week, 80.9% of all beds are currently in use, with 4.7% being used for coronavirus, and 1,247 coronavirus patients in Ohio. Pennsylvania did not make the list this week, which is my state. It had made the list the last 2 previous weeks, but the next state on our list is Rhode Island. And Rhode Island continues to use up a large percentage of their hospital beds. 90.92% of all beds are being used in Rhode Island, with 2.91% being used for coronavirus. That is a slight drop in coronavirus patients, with there being 66 patients in the hospital for coronavirus. South Carolina is the next state on our list, and in South Carolina this week, oops, that's South Dakota. We want South Carolina. And in South Carolina this week, there is 81.11% of all beds being used, 2.38% is being used for coronavirus, and 231 coronavirus patients. Washington State. Washington State this week did make the cut yet again. And in Washington State this week, currently 83.88% of all beds are being used, with 3.46% being used for coronavirus, with 369 coronavirus patients. Finally on our list is West Virginia. West Virginia continues to have hospital capacity over 80%, and this week they're using 84.26% of all beds, with 3.97% of the beds being used for coronavirus and 186 coronavirus patients. So we do see that there are slightly less number of states being used, with 80% their hospital capacity being used. But nonetheless, there are still 17 of them, and I suspect as time goes on, we probably will see that number go back up again. And disclaimer, this does not reflect the children's hospital crisis that is going on across the country. If I could, I would make a separate list for the percent of capacity being used at the children's hospitals in each state, but I don't have that individual data, and it would take a lot of time to go through each children's hospital in each state. So therefore, we're not going to do that. But down the line, I may do a couple here and there ICU capacity updates I've been considering doing, and we may do one of them this weekend, just to see how states are doing with the ICU capacity. And it'll be very interesting, if I do that, to see how many states are over 80%. I would suspect quite a few states are. Would it be the same number as hospital beds? Don't know. Stay tuned for that video, which will probably come this weekend. I definitely think I'm going to do that. Alrighty, if you like what you see here and you want to see more videos like this, hit the like and subscribe button down below. And remember, stay safe, everyone.